Right. Looks like we are live.
Yep.
So, good evening, everyone. My name is Cam Lawrence. I work as a project coordinator at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. We'll kind of stretch this out as people are probably tuning in here a little bit, but thank you all for tuning in for this presentation of naval history as it relates to the state of Wisconsin. Tonight, our presenters are going to be discussing the history of USS Cobia. So, naval history fans, you may know Cobia is a Gato class submarine, which served in World War II. But after its war service, the boat spent some time in and around Milwaukee and became a regular site for the lakefront residents of Bayview. Cobia is now permanently moored in the Manitowoc River and is maintained as a museum ship by the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. USS Cobia is regularly open for public tours, overnights, and other learning experiences. Our speaker tonight, DJ Palama, will share with you the history of this boat and some of their research into Cobia's service time, both during the war and in Milwaukee and Bayview. DJ is an avid historian and has been involved with the Wisconsin Maritime Museum for 6 years in various capacities, including tour guide and reenactor. DJ also participates in historical reenactments and other history focused events around the country. In conversation with our presenter tonight is historian and retired shipwreck diver James Heinz. James serves as
Hi there.
acquisitions curator of the Wisconsin Maritime Historical Society. He works tirelessly sharing stories of Great Lakes maritime history on the WMHS blog posts and the Facebook page. Having been social media manager at the museum, I have definitely shared several of those posts in a pinch. They are excellent, well researched. Love them.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you.
so I would like to thank the Bayview Historical Society for organizing tonight's event and hosting everyone on this online format. And members of the audience, as we're going through, if you have questions, you can type them into the comment section and we can pull them up during the Q&A portion of the presentation. So without further ado, I give you DJ Palama.
Okay. Hello. Today I'll be talking about the Cobia. First, I'm going to explain a little bit about the Gato class submarines in general, as they were built in several different areas outside of just Manitowoc and the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut. Just give you a general layout of it, and then the Cobia's wartime patrol and what she did post-war. So we're going to go with here. This is a picture of the silver side, but it kind of would give you an idea of what the Cobia would have looked like while she was being built in Groton, Connecticut. They were the first mass produced submarines for the United States, and also for the first time an attempt to try to create what was known as a fleet class submarine, which means that the original intention is that they would have been sort of the forward guard and the rear guard for stuff like battleships and other more traditional naval styles of tactic. But obviously, with Pearl Harbor damaging much of the Pacific Fleet, submarines and aircraft carriers now become the new offensive weapon instead of what was originally meant to be a defensive weapon. 77 were built, and about 20 of them were lost. So that means we lost in about approximation of 3,000 men over the course of the war. All right, this kind of gives you a general overlay of the submarines of the Gato class. They're kind of divided into 7 different rooms or chambers, if you want to. Got the conning tower, stuff of that nature. This is directly from the submarine archives from the U.S. Navy. Giving you a picture of the forward part of the boat, you can see that it flies the traditional ensign from going back to roughly the War of 1812. There would have been 48 stars on that flag for the 48 states in the Union at the time. This gives you a good idea of the deck guns and the conning tower. The deck guns were the primary weapons of the Cobia while on surface, because each of the Mark 14 torpedoes cost about $10,000 to make. So you can imagine during wartime that adds up and up. So the deck guns were meant to try to cripple enemy Japanese merchant vessels by crippling ones that they knew that were weakly armored or were already on the verge of sinking. All right, this gives you an idea of the guns that are on the back, because again, you got to have as much firepower as possible to try to take down merchant ships, and they'd also have machine guns on the side. The bell is not really a part of the ship while underway, because obviously the clanging would make it instantaneously noticeable. But again, that goes back to old nautical traditions of being able to tell time. If you look closely, you might be able to see a broomstick that's on top of the conning tower. And that means when you would go into, let's say, Pearl Harbor or New London in Australia, that means you have a clean sweep, which means you wiped out all of your opponent's ships and used up all of your torpedoes. So it was a signifier that you literally, sort of like in baseball, had a clean sweep of your antagonists. This is a 3-inch deck gun. The Cobia historically would have had either a 4 or a 5-inch one, depending on the year of the war, because they switched them out for either better conditions, really up to the captain. While they were restoring her, there was no 5-inch guns left over from the war, so we currently just have the 3-inch deck guns until we can find something that's a little more accurate. This is the forward torpedo tube. There would have been 6 of them in total, each of them carrying at least 1 torpedo on the inside of them. They would have been mostly the Mark 14 torpedo at that time. This was officers' country. This would have been considered the most comfortable space on the boat, but it's important to keep in mind that even the captain, who was named Becker, his office was no big, or his room was no bigger than a walk-in closet. So when you would go in there, it's not very big. So even the officers, while they might have to have their own individual bunks, still had to share a room. So there would have been 6 officers in these areas. Captain has the room to himself, and then the CPOs would have had about 5 men in their room. This right here, this is the control room. This is kind of the brains of the operations. On top of the ladder, you can see where the radar and stuff would be located. Right here, this is the cruise galley, or the mess. This is probably the most important room in terms of being a central hub and places for the men to not just eat but entertain themselves, read books, watch movies. There was several times where you're on a tour of duty, you might only have about 2 or 3 films that were given to you by the government to watch, and you'd rewatch them over and over again. There is one veteran that said that he watched The Wizard of Oz so many times that he never got the songs out of his head well into later in life. This would be crew's quarters. You'll notice there's only about 36 bunks for a group of 72 men, which means that they did what was called hot bunking, where each of the men had to share a rack because of each of their duty. And literally, when you crawl into the bed, everything was already warm on top of the submarine already being 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the forward engine room. The Cobia and other Gato class submarines were all basically electric diesel, sort of like a car nowadays. These particular ones were made by GM. This gives you kind of the electrical control room. the little thing that looks like a grid, we often call it the cubicle, and that controls like where all the electricity and stuff are that are on the boat. And then this is the aft torpedo room. Unlike the forward torpedo room, it only has four torpedoes, four torpedo rooms in it, or four torpedoes in it, which means that you carry four torpedoes and 8 in the rear, and then 12 in front. And then this is what the aft side of the Cobia looks like currently. The little stair ramps are not original to the ship. Those are added on later on so the public can actually go into it. But during wartime, that's where the torpedoes would have been loaded through. And then if you're wondering what a cobia is, it's a type of fish that's a small little predatory fish. And this is what the boat is named after. All right, so commissioning. She was commissioned in November of 1943 and went out to sail from Newport, Connecticut in 1944. When she left the Electric Boat Company, she basically had to make her way from the East Coast all the way down through the Panama Canal Zone. And what makes this area particularly dangerous, especially around Florida and Cuba, was the fact that even as late as 1944, there still was a few German U-boats patrolling the area. It was often called the Turkey Shoot area. So some of the veterans mentioned that they saw blips of what could be possibly German U-boats in the region. And then en route to Pearl Harbor, she was eventually trained. His crew was trained on there, and the first torpedo launches were done in Pearl Harbor in June of 44, and then she was ready for sea by 1944. And then this is a little bit about Captain Becker. He was born in Mississippi in 1911, which means that he was only 32 years old while captain of the submarine. He saw some duty in the Atlantic theater because the U.S. did have about 5 or 6 Gato-class submarines attempting to try to help the British with their convoy system, but it was not as extensively big as in the Pacific, obviously. And then his naval career started in 1936 when he was using pre-war, almost World War I era submarines. And then eventually he became kind of the mothball fleet commander and then retired to become a teacher in 1964 as the rank of captain in the Navy. All right, so this is the Cobia being launched. You'll notice that this is the traditional style. If you look at Manitowoc, Manitowoc submarines were generally side launched, the Great Lakes style. Cobia, since she was built in Groton, Connecticut, would have been launched to traditional Seaway. All right, so this is the commissioning party that would have happened in May of 1944. So you can see the crew is looking nice, young, and fresh. Not a dirty speck on them. They got nice uniforms, and the girlfriends are with them. Same crew, posing for their pictures. This is when she was this is when the ensigns were first put onto the submarine before she was launched, or sent out to sea. And this is her decking in 1944. So right before she was preparing to leave for Pearl Harbor. Officers and crewmen posing again right before them going into their first patrol. Okay, to kind of give you an idea, when it comes to where the Cobia's center of attention was, it mostly came from New London, Australia, where she was based. and she mostly worked around where you can kind of see this is an Allied warplane for a potential invasion of Japan in 1942. So the areas in red were all areas that were conquered by Japan from 1937 onwards. So the Cobia's main actions were mostly around what you see as modern day Borneo, Malaysia, the the former Dutch East Indies colonies, um, Indochina slash Vietnam, and Thailand. Or basically around that general area for her 6 tours of duty, because it's important to remember those regions had rubber and oil, which were essential to the Japanese warfront effort. And to answer Joel's questions, the Manitowoc ships or boats that were built up here went from Lake Michigan down to Chicago to the Sanitary River, eventually.
DJ, if you can hear me, your mic has gone out.
All right, can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So in July of 1944, she left Pearl Harbor to the Bonin Islands, which is probably most famous for the Battle of Iwo Jima. She sank a number of merchant vessels prior to Iwo Jima, but probably the most significant achievement she did was sinking a Maru class transport ship. All right, can you hear me again?
Yes.
Sorry about that. It's really acting up. Okay, so that being said, since they were able to sink the transport ship from the 26th Tank Regiment, that meant that the Japanese did not get more tanks on the island until December, which means that the Marine Corps was able to hold out and then eventually win the battle. And after Battle of Iwo Jima ended in 44, the Cobia was awarded a letter of recognition from the USMC for their help in sinking the Maru class. And this is what it would have looked like with several different minor design changes, because this is fairly early on in the look, but this is what the tank transport would have looked like. A Maru class within the Japanese Navy or Merchant Marine was pretty much anything that was taken from civilians and then put either into naval use or, as dumb as it sounds, the Japanese Army also had its own Navy because the Japanese Army and Navy didn't get along. So if you ever see anything with Maru, it either means it was used by the Navy or it would have been used by the Army. Okay, and during that same tour of duty, when they sank a merchant vessel, they came across a couple of survivors. Only Ona Tora was the only one that accepted the Americans' offer for becoming a prisoner of war. So the the members of the crew ended up calling him Tojo after the military dictator that was in charge of most Japanese operations in their empire at the time. So he's basically well known on this ship for basically on the forward torpedo tubes. They put the Japanese flags for the merchant ships or military vessels that they sunk on it, and he corrected the numbers of stripes on it. And then eventually he went around, going around repainting things in Japanese kanji. Right now on display, we have the auxiliary compass, which he wrote in kanji as radio. So we have that in display. Ultimately, he was taken to the Marshall Islands and drafted as a worker for the U.S. Marine Corps, but he said he wanted to stay within the sub crew because he liked them better than the Marines because he thought the Marines were kind of scary. And this is the crew after her first war patrol. You may notice that there's an African American sailor among him. His name is Edward Bryant, and he is a cook at the age of 18. He was often nicknamed the Count.
Your mic's gone out again.
All right, can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay. This is obviously not a good USB, so I'm going to have to try to change it. Okay. Anyway, did it. I'll just repeat what I said. The African American sailor was a cook by the name of Edward Brennett. Even the cooks had to be able to understand everything on how the submarines worked because if one person got injured, you would have to take his job. So the submarine corps offered, unlike the surface navy, offered a lot of African American sailors a lot of the same opportunities that their European American counterparts would have had, which was kind of unique to the Navy. You'll also notice that the Cobia's battle flag right there, the fish itself was actually designed by an artist at the Walt Disney Company. All right, so I'm going to kind of combine the second and third war patrol, which was from September of 44, and then the fifth patrol ended in January of 1945. They mostly, again, passed Saipan and did a lot of just basic encounters with trying to sink Japanese ships. In October, it had a dogfight with a Japanese aircraft, and it caused one of the ballast tanks to actually become heavily damaged. So Becker and another sailor by the name of Klebetz was the only one that had any experience with diving. So they actually had to do repairs in the middle of the Pacific Ocean without anybody else with them. And then in late October, there was a lot of bad storms in the area, so the crew got extremely sick. But they also passed the equator. Thus, the term for sailors that haven't passed the equators is polywogs, and sailors. Can you hear me?
Yes. Now I can hear you.
Okay, I'm just going to stop using that mic and then just use my computers. Okay, so as I was saying, in late October, they had many storms in the region, so a lot of the crew was reported as being sick. And then later in October as well, they passed the equator, which means they had the Lord Neptune party, which means that sailors that hadn't crossed the equator yet were known as polywogs, while after they crossed the equator, they were known as shellbacks. And again, this is an old nautical tradition that goes back to the Royal Navy, and in some cases like the Dutch Navy. But for most of November into January, they spent most of the time retrofitting the ship in Australia. So this to continue on, she rescued 2 more Japanese POWs from drowning. She sank the mineslayer, the Yurishima. The Cobia again was attacked by another bomber, and then once again she rescued 2 more people, 2 more Japanese sailors that had been stuck on a raft for almost 40 days. So this is Captain Becker and some of the other officers with him. You'll notice that most of them all have facial hair, and that's because fresh water was a limited commodity on submarines. You had to basically save that for the diesel engines and cooling them down, and also making sure that the crew had enough water to drink. So shaving was not a top priority. So you'll notice in many pictures of sailors that are in submarines, they will have facial hair. This is one of the junior officers on the conning tower with their doing a lookout. This is the crew that most people that if you enter the museum, this is the picture of the crew they're probably most familiar with. But once again, you'll kind of see that the guys are all kind of looking raggedy and wearing kind of whatever they want to because of comfort reasons. Once again, the average temperature inside the submarine was 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And then once you get into the engine rooms, you're getting into temperatures that are over 100 degrees in some points. So a lot of these guys are even overdressed for that. And you also have to take into account the Pacific is also very warm and humid. This is the flag by the end of the 3rd tour. By this point, the flag had been known as the Sergeant Fish, because if you look closely at the fin of the Cobia design, that it has the little sergeant stripes. You'll notice if you also look at the flags, you'll notice that they have the little red meatball means that those are merchant vessels that they sank, and then the one with the rising star flag means that they're Japanese military vessels. So again, mostly sinking Maru class or 1 or 2 mine sweepers. So I'll get more into that once we get towards the end of the war. This is the 4th patrol, which happened between February and May of 1945. On their way in late February, they met a Dutch submarine because, again, the Dutch were in the East Indies at the time. And they had mentioned that they encountered a Japanese convoy. So when they came in contact with that convoy, there was a young man named Ralph Clark Houston Jr. He exchanges fire with the Japanese boats for several minutes, but he's eventually killed in action. He was buried out at sea in Vietnam, and off the coast of Vietnam, and basically they used the Yeoman's door to help slide him in. And then most of March did not see any action. So this is Ralph Clark Houston Jr. himself. The way that you see him dressed on the deck of the Cobia is actually generally how the crew would have looked like underway, where they'll have maybe their hat on and then their like swim trunks and shoes, again, because of heat. He was a seaman first class. He was born on September 27th, 1925. So that means he was only 19 years old when he passed away, and he had only been on the Cobia for literally about 2 weeks before his tour of duty. So he was on it a very short time. This is the gun that he was manning when he was battling against the Japanese ships. And what was mentioned in, I'm going to hold up this book. This is called the USS Cobia at War. It was written by a guy that served on the Cobia while she was in Bayview. So he goes into great detail about explaining what would happen, but I'll kind of make it brief and quick. What happened is when he was firing this 20 millimeter, some of the guns started to jam because they weren't loaded properly. So, you get a few bangs off, eventually hitting the enemy vessel. But at the same time, Ralph ends up getting hit by 50 millimeter anti artillery, or by basically anti artillery rounds, and he gets basically punctured right up in the upper arm, and then right here on to the lower abdomen area. So if you want to get an idea of size, this is where they keep the this is where they would have kept the shells from the for the main deck guns, but you'll notice that's a big hole that they got from the exchange and fire. So that's the type of caliber that Ralph ended up getting hit with. So you can imagine that's a big hole. And in their mentioning during this battle, the radar is located not too far away from where this hole is located. So after the battle, the radar was actually heavily damaged, so they had to try to repair it at sea. And then this is Ralph's being buried at sea. He is so far the only known sailor who has a picture of his burial at sea on a submarine during World War II. So that kind of makes it a unique photograph in that regard, even if it is sad. And then right here, this is during the 5th War Patrol. This is the next kind of big thing that happened is the Cobia rescued 7 down airmen. And I'll go into that in the next slide. So what happened right there is these guys were supposed to be flying over Saigon in Vietnam, which was nominally controlled by the Vichy French, who were allied with the Axis powers for the most part. So the Japanese were allowed to kind of work their way through most of Vietnam and the rest of the Indochina Peninsula. So we were using B-42 bomber missions to kind of spy on and see what was going on. And they were attacked by a bunch of Japanese Zeros. So they bailed off of their aircraft, and the six men of the crew survived, and the pilots end up floating out at sea for a while. The Cobia did not intend to actually, the Cobia was not trying to do a life-saving rescue. They actually accidentally came across them. The airman, one of the airmen was actually scared that he was being captured by the Japanese. So they actually had to try to drag him out from underneath the raft that he was on. And then he tried basically attacking the U.S. sailors with the submarine with his little airman knife. So that was a little bit dangerous until they're like, we're Americans, you can relax. And if you want to read more about the autobiography of some of these airmen, this website right down below is by one of the guys that was rescued by the Cobia. Post-war, they were on the Cobia for about 7 to 10 days, and they eventually became used to working on the subs layout because some of them were already electricians. So by the time that the Cobia gets back to Australia, Captain Becker makes them honorary sub members. So they and their families were always allowed to come back to the reunions at the Cobia after the war in the 80s. So this is what I mentioned when they were basically on the little life rafts being brought in. And then this is the Cobia crew bringing them up overboard. So these are, and again, as you can see, as I mentioned earlier, the doorways weren't there that are on the modern day museum ship, but the torpedo launches were, kind of give you an idea of what she looked like during wartime. The 5th and 6th Patrol, the 5th Patrol is considered one of the more successful ones, while the 6th Patrol saw a new captain come on board because Becker was needed elsewhere at the time. So this was the only patrol that he was not on. The most important thing that happened here was the duel between the Cobia and the Japanese minesweeper called the Hasutaka. The Hasutaka was a military escort that the Japanese had built during the interwar time period to try to make stopgaps for basically protection for convoys. The problem is that they did not have enough, let's say, weaponry like machine guns and stuff to properly arm this minesweeper. So all of the mines were taken off and given to ships that were more considered priority ones. So all they had was racks of depth charges, and basically most of the crew was all middle-aged men. So again, this was not considered a top-of-the-line enemy vessel. But when it came into contact with the Cobia, for close to 6 to 8 hours, they were throwing depth charges over the sides. And what happened is when you normally hear a depth charge, it'll click and cause an explosion. Well, what happened is the depth charges actually bounced off of the Cobia's hull and into the mud in the Sea of Saigon. And if you're not familiar with the Sea of Saigon, the Sea of Thailand, it's very muddy and very shallow. So with the depth charges, they were only about 120 feet underwater, so they literally were getting stuck in the mud. So now some of the power runs out, and one of the veterans mentions that the captain said, "Light him up if you got him." And what happened is the smoke from the cigarettes, because the atmosphere was so tense, that the smoke from the cigarettes was so thick that you could literally cut your way through it. And eventually power comes back on, but now they have to deal with the fact that they can't get the rotor moving. So how do you get the boat out of the shallow waters? They literally had to rock the boat for about 3.5 hours. So they had 40 men in the aft torpedo room and 40 men in the forward torpedo room, basically running backwards and forwards as fast as they could so they could shake the boat literally to get it out of the mud. And eventually they were successful. But that was the closest the Cobia ever came to sinking during the war, and also probably the most danger she was in. And as I said, this is the Hashutaka. This photograph was taken in 1939 to just kind of give you an idea of what the ship looked like. Again, it was not considered top of the line, so it was only armed with the depth charges. And again, once they threw all of them overboard, they just kind of went on their merry way, assuming they had sunk the sub. And the reason why that is because this convoy was actually patrolled by several of the Manitowoc-built ships or boats, as well as a few British and Dutch submarines. The Baleo class, the USS Legardo, was actually sunk by the minesweeper in early May of 1945. Then on Mother's Day, she almost sank the Cobia. And then just a few days later, the USS Hawkbill, which was another Gato-class submarine that had been built by the Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company, actually was the one to successfully sink the minesweeper. And we actually have the minesweeper's life preserver in our collections at the museum. Okay, so the end of the war, once again, they were mostly hanging around Saipan. Most of the crew knew that this tour was going to be relatively short because they had heard that the Soviets finally ended their non-aggression pact with Japan. So that means that the Soviets are now invading Manchuria. Also at this time, after the Battle of Okinawa, we had been busy bombarding the Japanese with conventional bombing raids using B-24s. So we knew that was going on. And then most of the Japanese Navy was destroyed at Leyte Gulf at the largest naval battle of World War II. So by that point, the crew of the Cobia knew that the war was pretty much going to be over. And they kind of just hung around Saipan and then Australia until the end of the war. And then eventually she returned back to New London in Connecticut by November of 1945. And as I mentioned, of her 6 war patrols, the 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 5th were designated as successful, for which she received 4 battle stars. And these are all under the command of Captain Becker. So he was considered the main star of the Cobia in terms of leadership. And then she was accredited with sinking almost 17,000 tons of enemy merchant shipping. Again, majority of those were like trawlers, a couple of small yacht ships, and then they took down a couple of one or two Maru class ships that were, again, used by the Army or the Japanese Imperial Navy. So for being a late war boat, she was pretty successful for what she was doing. This is what the flag looked like towards the end of the war. I believe this is a reunion flag, but you'll notice that they have the stripes for all of the merchant ships that she sunk under the meatball flag. And then with the rising star flag is all the ships that she sunk that belong to either the Japanese military or the Japanese Navy. And then you also have the 7 down Allied pilots with a little parachute. So that was eventually added onto it. And again, each crew is allowed to kind of make up their own design for their battle ensign. This is the crew at the end of the war at New London. So again, you'll notice the guys just kind of are wearing whatever, looking relaxed and like, thank God the war is finally over. All right, so after she came back to Connecticut, this is during the Korean War period in the early Cold War period. So this is right before before the Soviets really had any nuclear capabilities, and before there was a lot of major aggression in the Cold War outside of the Korean Peninsula. So Cobia was put into basically the reserve fleet in 1946. During the Korean War, she was not sent overseas, but she mostly did war maneuvers around the Florida Keys in 1952, which I have a few pictures of. Her last dive was done in 1953 to make sure everything was still functional on her. And then the Navy decided that she was starting to get too old because they were starting to change a lot of the Gato and Balo class submarines into the early Guppy programs, which was starting to modernize them for the earlier stages of the Cold War. So she was mothballed until 1959 when Captain Becker, who is now in charge of a lot of the mothball fleet, decided that she was going to be brought to Milwaukee because they needed a new submarine because their training platform was starting to get old. By 1959, a lot of people ask why the Great Lakes subs went down the Mississippi River. That's because the St. Lawrence Seaway did not yet exist. So now that it did, they were able to take her through the sea lane with all of the anchors and stuff removed because technically we have a treaty with Canada that we're not allowed to have any active warships with weaponry on any of the Great Lakes. So she was moved up. She actually got stuck for a little while and her anchor was cut loose, and then eventually the Coast Guard grabbed it up and then shipped it up to Milwaukee on a flatbed truck. So this is from her war maneuvers in Key West, Florida in 1952, along with other Gato class submarines. And again, these are kind of just more war Korean War memorial maneuvers, I should say, going on at the time. Again, you can still see that the crews, even into the 1950s, were still relatively relaxed and informal looking. And this is, again, part of their training crew in Florida, but you'll notice that all of her main guns have been taken off by that point. So she was only used for maneuvering. And this is about the same time of her last diving as well. And now we finally get to when she was in Bayview, which was from 1959 to 1970. So Cobia actually saw the longest period of her use being used as a training platform versus a active warship. So from 1959 to 1970, as I said, she was moved via the St. Lawrence Seaway, and then in August of 1959, she was finally moved to Milwaukee. In 1960, Both the Cobia and another Gato-class submarine called the Tattag were both torn from their moorings because of a bad blizzard going on. And a lot of the old timers will say that's when they watched the submarine races in Milwaukee. Then for the rest of Cobia's tour, or I should say, rest of her time in Bayview, she was mostly used for training and sponsoring the Sea Cadets, so they would have, training on ships for their scouting program. She was finally decommissioned in the Navy in 1970s and then brought to the Submariner Memorial in Manitowoc because the current Maritime Museum was helped funded by a lot of the veterans who had came to Manitowoc as part of the submarine crews that were in training on Lake Michigan. A lot of them obviously married local ladies, and then they eventually helped form the museum as we know it today. And then in 1986, she became a national landmark and was recognized as an international memorial for all nations with submariners. So this is Bayview's / Milwaukee's first submarine, the USS Tattag. She had a very successful war run and probably was one of the most successful Gato-class ships of World War II. But again, sort of like the Cobia, they stripped most of her guns off and only kept the rear guns on them. So this would have been where the Milwaukee Riverway is nowadays, where you basically can walk around downtown on the little sidewalks. So that's where that would have been located at the time before they were moved to Jones Islands. And again, this is Tattag with Tug when she was eventually moved to Jones Island. This is in 1959 when the Cobia finally came here in August. The Tattag was kept until early 1960s. So this is the two submarines together. So the only time the two Gato classes are with each other. And again, this is done in 1959 during the summertime, and you can obviously recognize the Milwaukee Reef. And then this is literally when people joke about the submarine races with the moorings coming loose. As you can see, there was a lot of ice sheets at the time, so both of the submarines came loose from the moorings that they had off of the little platform right there. So literally the submarines were racing each other. And then this is again from when they got off of their moorings. So the ships are basically, or the boats are basically floating around without any rudders or anything on them. So they had to eventually be pulled back by a tugboat. And then this is from roughly the 1960s. And this is the Cobia when she was near Jones Island. And I'm sure most of you can probably recognize that little skyscraper over there in Bayview. This is her at her mooring. Again, this is her at Jones Island when she's being used as a training platform. And again, you'll notice that most of her guns were taken off at the time. This is the Cobia during one of the winter months of the 1960s. So she, again, pretty much just a training platform. And then in 1970, this is when she was starting to be pulled up to Manitowoc. So you can see her with the little famous lighthouse that's in Milwaukee Harbor being pulled by two of the tugboats because she did not have a propeller to move her by herself. So the tugboats basically tugged her up to Manitowoc. So this is a nice shot of her with the city of Milwaukee in the background. Again, being taken up to Lake Michigan. Some more of being tugged up to Lake Michigan, or being up to Lake Michigan to Manitowoc. And that's kind of just the basic summary of the War Patrol. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
All right. DJ, thank you very much for your presentation. We certainly do appreciate that. I do have a couple questions here to ask you. One moment, please. Okay. Were there any height restrictions for someone serving on these submarines?
In general, no. Basically, in order to get into the submarine corps during World War II, you would have to go through sub school, and basically you had to make sure that you were mentally sound, so you weren't claustrophobic or you didn't get any being afraid of being stuck in the dark. You also had to be tested to understand that you knew everything about the submarine, because if one person got hurt, you only have a crew of 72 enlisted men, so everybody had to know about more than just their jobs. So let's say you're a torpedo man and let's say one of the electricians had to get hurt. You had to pass tests to understand that certain section. So the answer is no, there was no height or weight restrictions. Technically, as we know of, the tallest guy was about 6'7", according to U.S. government records.
All right. We hear much about the German U-boats. Is it true that American subs sank more shipping than the German subs?
Yes. The German submarines were fairly successful at the start of World War II, not necessarily because they were high class, because you got to keep in mind, the German economy's peak production did not happen until 1944, and by that point, the Soviets are already steamrolling them on the Eastern Front. So most of the submarines did what they call the wolf pack attack. So the two advantages that they had at the start of the war was that they had slightly better sonar and that their torpedoes were a little bit better than the Americans. But overall, the Germans, were fairly successful at the start of the war because the British had no idea what they were doing. And really early on, they didn't have any allies. But by the time the United States starts getting involved with the convoy system, they come up with deterrence and they start using radar. They start using sonar, and that makes the German wolf pack attacks much less successful. If you kind of want to get an idea of their attrition rate, almost 80% of all U-boats ended up sinking over the course of the war. So the Germans basically attacked hard and then never came back home. While our submarines, again, were what we would consider fleet class, which means that they were much larger than the conventional German U-boats, which means that they could patrol by themselves and had a much greater range of, technically they could circumnavigate half the globe if they needed to, but you wouldn't want to do that under your own power. But our subs could go farther. Our torpedoes weren't that great, but again, as long as they hit the target, that helps. The submarine corps sank almost 55% of all Japanese merchant vessels and a bunch of military vessels, meaning that only 2% of the entire Navy did 55% of the entire damage, if you kind of want to get a scope of how important submarines are.
All right. What was the largest ship ever sunk by a submarine?
There's a couple of cases. Probably one of the most, at least in terms of American, they managed to sink the Japanese battleship, the Congo, which was in a 1920s era heavy battleship. So that was one of the bigger ones. A Gato-class submarine. I'm sure everybody's probably familiar with the Japanese battleship, the Yamato. One of Yamato's sister class ships was turned into an aircraft carrier, and one of the Gato class subs was actually able to puncture a big hole into the side of it. It didn't sink it, but it basically rendered it inoperational for the duration of the war. So they could pack a punch if they needed to, but you generally don't want to go after warships because warships have things that can destroy you.
All right. Are there any other World War II submarines still preserved today?
Yes. There are 6 Gato-class submarines that are still preserved within the United States. There's the Silversides, which is in Michigan, the USS Cod, which is in, I believe, Ohio. There's one in San Diego, one that's dry docked in Oklahoma that recently, due to all the floodings, literally floated down the river and now is placed in a new area because they never expected the sub to ever move again. That happened just last year. And then I know that there's one in Pearl Harbor.
All right. Did any other countries use the Gato class submarine?
Yes. The Gato class, after World War II ended, was obviously starting to become obsolete. So a lot of smaller nations that were joining NATO obviously needed to form their own navies. So again, through like the Marshall Plan and then other Lend-Lease programs that happened post-war, all of a sudden you get Taiwan getting Gato class submarines. You get Turkey using Gato class submarines. You have some South American countries using Gato class submarines. And probably most ironically, the Republic of Japan actually ends up using Gato class submarines as their main self-defense, main submarines in their own self-defense force post-war. And then Korea also used Gato class ships. So the ones that weren't sold off ended up becoming part of the Guppy programs, which would become the forerunners to using stuff like the Trident missile system and then eventually the nuclear submarines.
All right. Are some of the former servicemen from the Cobia still with us today?
Yes, there are 3 men that are still alive from the Cobia.
Okay. And I think we know the answer to this, but someone did ask it, so I will ask it. Could the Cobia still submerge or put to sea today?
She has 1 dive left in her, no resurfacing. The reason why is the bulkhead doors that are on the boat basically would have let in all of the water, and we don't have a propeller either, so she can dive, but she can't come back up.
Okay. Cam, do I still have time for a couple questions of my own? I'm sorry, your mic isn't working.
That helps. Yeah, looks like we've got about just under 5 minutes here yet. So yeah.
DJ, there is a group of reenactors? Is that not correct?
Correct.
For the Cobia, and are you a member of that group?
Yes, I am. I helped found it about 6 years ago, along with my father and one of my friends that was on the one of the nuclear submarines during the Iraq War. So he was a torpedoman's mate. So the 3 of us helped gather the resources together, and we do it about 3 or 4 times out of the year on the submarine itself. Obviously, COVID is going to kind of get in the way of it, but we'll probably post once it gets back up and going again.
Okay. And where will you post that? I would be interested in covering that for the Marine History Society.
Probably on the Facebook page.
Okay.
We also have a group on Facebook for the reenactors called the USS Cobia reenacting group or something along those lines.
All right. Do you reenact a specific Cobia crew member?
I do not, but I pretend to be I basically pretend to be the Yaleman, who is the guy that's in charge of pay and a lot of the secretarial jobs on the Cobia. I sometimes also do one of the lieutenants or chief petty officers, depending on how many guys we have on the boat at the time.
Have you ever met any of the Cobia survivors?
Yes, I have. One of the guys was up during one of the first subfests, and he's like, "This is so cool seeing people basically wearing his old uniforms."
All right. Cam, do you have any questions?
About covers it, I think. We had some questions about submarine races, but I think we covered that. So unless there's other questions, thank you, DJ, for this wonderful, informative presentation. Let's see. And yeah, if you folks in the audience have questions or want more information, please feel free to reach out to the Maritime Museum. DJ here works with us, the Historical Society. And we can be reached online or through Facebook. And thanks all for tuning in tonight.
I believe that wasn't the Fairbanks one the secondary torpedo or secondary engine room?
To my knowledge, they're all General Electric engines. Yeah, the Fairbanks Morse were in some other Gato classes, not the one. Well, yes, some of the Gato, not Cobia though.
Yeah, I was pretty sure Cobia was always GM.
Mhm. Got some folks that were visitors. I haven't had the luck or the opportunity to meet any of the Cobia crew members yet, unfortunately. So I'm really looking forward to that. I hope we have the opportunity to meet some during Subfest this coming summer. And, of course, they're a wealth of knowledge. That firsthand information is just unbeatable. But with that, brings us almost up to an hour. So, like I said, thanks for tuning in and have a great night.
You too.